Hello and welcome to our module on knowing how to use formal and informal writing in the workplace. Within this module you'll find a fact sheet, and I suggest that you perhaps pause the video at this point, go away and download the fact sheet, possibly print it out, and then use that to help you as you go through the video explanation, as the two are very closely connected. And then I'll continue with the video explanation to explain how to use both formal and informal writing in your workplace. One of the things you need to consider is the type of document that you're actually going to write, and there are loads of different types of documents around. First, we're going to look at some of the more formal types of document. So these may include questionnaires, invoices, terms and conditions, business plans, contracts, brochures, manuals, proposals, forms, minutes, guides, letters, and agendas. Now, you may not be involved with writing all of these different types of documents. It will depend on what your job role is. You'll probably come into contact with a few of them as you go through your working life, and you may be asked to make some changes to them. You might be asked to update a manual or a guide. You might be asked to send a formal letter to someone. You might be asked to update an invoice or a brochure. So it is always worth knowing the style, and if you are updating something, then obviously check what style has been used already and make sure that you replicate that style as you go through. And in a moment, we're going to look at some of the different styles and sentence types that you'll see in the different types of documents. Then we come to some of the informal document types. Not as many of these that you'll use within the workplace. So you may have some kind of instant message system set up that you use to communicate with colleagues. You may use text messages. Notes, I'm thinking, if you leave a note on somebody's desk to say that Phil called at 3 o'clock, or don't forget to photocopy the notes for the meeting, that sort of thing. You may have some kind of forum within your workplace as well, where everyone can post on, or some kind of intranet where you can actually make notes. And then you may have a workplace social media that's for the public, so for your customers and clients, and you may post on that on behalf of your business. So those are all the ones that would use a much more relaxed, informal style. And then we have emails and websites, which can come somewhere in between the two. And that will mainly depend upon the audience. So for example, an email to a close colleague, it's very similar to a text message. It just needs to be short and brief, and it can use informal, chatty language. An email to one of the stakeholders in the business would need to be extremely formal and only use formal language. So with emails, it all depends on the audience you use and the relationship you have with that audience. Websites is also a little bit similar, and that will depend upon your client base and the type of business you are and the brand. So if your business brand is something that's quite fun, young, vibrant, then your website will have a more chatty feel, will feel quite informal to match that brand. If your business brand is very professional, formal, then of course your website will also match that and will also use more formal language. So a lot of these things, it will depend upon who you're actually sending your piece of writing to. And before you start any piece of writing, you should always consider the audience. Who is it actually aimed at? What's my relationship with them? As in, how well do I know them? Is it expected to be a very professional relationship? Is it more friendly? Have they communicated with you in the past? And I tend to always advise people to communicate at one level of professionalism above, or at least one level above, the way someone else communicates with them. So if they send you a more friendly message, then you might be able to be a little bit more informal with the way you send a message back to them, but never be less formal than they are. So let's look at some of the fine differences between the two. So an informal style of writing might use first person or second person, where formal will use third person. And in a little bit, I'll go through what each of these actually means. So don't worry if you're not familiar with some of this terminology. Informal will always make use of contractions, whereas in very formal writing, words are written in full. And it's good to think of formal and informal as a sort of scale. There's not really one point where it tips from one to the other. So sometimes you can be extremely informal, sometimes extremely formal, and somewhere in between the two. And I'll give you some examples as we go through. Informal might make use of dashes and brackets and exclamation marks, whereas formal would avoid those type of punctuation and would just use the standard full stop, semicolons, colons, commas. In informal, you might use some humour, colloquial language or slang, which of course you would not do in a formal document. Informal often uses very simple sentences. Formal might use a variety, and they would be constructed very carefully using correct grammar and punctuation. Whereas in informal, although we're not encouraging you to make mistakes, it's not as rigid a structure. In terms of the voice you use, the active voice is used more in informal and in some formal language, and then the passive voice is used for very formal documents. Proofreading is essential with formal documents. You should always read everything that you're writing, but there may be some small errors in an informal document that can be overlooked, although it's best to always check and correct everything you can. Informal uses facts, as does formal, but informal can also use opinions and interpretation. And informal might use multiple verbs to describe actions, whereas formal will use single verbs. And as I said, we're going to look at what all of that means. So first of all, what is the first, second and third person? Well, the first person is when you're talking about yourself, really. So you're saying I, or we, or us, or other similar words. The second person is where you're directly talking to someone else using you. And the third is talking about somebody else in a more distant relationship. So he, she, it, they, or you might just give the full name of the person object, the man, London, rather than doing something more intimate. So some examples on the right hand side, you could say I finished the report, which would be first person, or the report has been completed. So you can see a slight difference in the formality there. We found the electrics were faulty. It has been discovered that there was a fault in the electrics. So just that difference there in the level of formality that's being used within the text. Mention contractions. So contractions are where you put words together to form one word using an apostrophe. So if we look on the right hand side, examples are haven't, which would be written in full as have not, wouldn't, would not, isn't, is not, and there's lots of other examples, of course, that you could have. So it's fine to use contractions most of the time in writing, but when you're doing the very formal document types, so reports or manuals, that's when you'd want to write the words out in full. And it's something you can check for at the end. When you're doing your proofreading, you can even set up a find and replace. And it's absolutely fine to use them in all types of emails. So it's just the very formal document types that you should avoid them in. So different types of punctuation you can use in your different styles. So in formal punctuation, we've talked about dashes and exclamation marks, maybe brackets, and they tend to reflect the way we speak and they reflect our emotion. So that's why we use them more in informal punctuation and informal text types. So you might leave a note for a colleague or send them a quick email. Don't forget to print the agenda for the meeting, exclamation mark. Now that's the sort of thing where you need to be slightly careful. You'd only do that to a colleague you knew very well with the exclamation mark, because that might be a little bit humorous. So it might say that perhaps they forgot last time, so don't forget this time. If you just sent it to someone you didn't know with the exclamation mark, it would come across a little bit harsh and angry, as if you're shouting at them. So again, it's all about considering the audience that you're actually sending that to. So if you want to be more formal, you could say, please bring a copy of the agenda to the meeting, or please can you print out the agenda for the meeting. So it's all about how well you know the person and whether you know how they'll receive that message. Again, you might type to your friend, I've asked for Friday afternoon off, I've got a doctor's appointment. If you're asking your line manager, perhaps someone you're not as familiar with, can I please take Friday afternoon as holiday as I have a doctor's appointment? So the level of formality is changing there depending upon who you're speaking to. And so that one's less about the type of thing you're typing, the type of document, so it could still be an email, but it's about the person or the audience, as we call it, that you're communicating with. We've touched on this briefly in our last page, so humour, colloquial language or slang. Really, the main thing to say there is just to be very careful of using that in any type of text, unless you know the recipient will understand it. So again, this is all about audience. So you'd never try and use humour in a report or in a manual. So there are some document types that would just never have humour in them. Humour mainly would be used perhaps in an email, in a note, and you might use, depending upon your brand, as we mentioned earlier, sometimes in your social media postings. If you're the person in charge of putting things on social media, you need to be aware of the brand image you're trying to convey for your company and whether humour is actually something relevant for that or whether it's out of place. And slang words, again, colloquial words, words that everyone will understand. Again, just be careful. Will people actually understand them? Are they words that relate to your culture but not someone else's? So things like don't forget to pop up for a cuppa on your break. Again, that's a little bit of slang there. It's nothing rude, but it's not something you would say to everybody. So again, you need to think about the recipient. Different sentence types. Now, you may be familiar with these from when you've studied English before. It may be something that you've forgotten about. And we have 3 different sentence types: simple, compound, and complex. So simple sentences have a subject, they have a verb, and they make one single point. They have one single idea. So if you look at the 3 sentences to the right, each of those has a subject. So in the first sentence, the subject is we. The verb is need to submit. And the single idea is that they need to submit the report by Friday. In the second sentence, the subject is it. So we're talking about the report. It has to contain is our verb. And the idea is it has to contain the full proposal. In our third sentence, our subject again is it. It needs to have is our verb. And the idea is it needs to have the graph of sales. So each of those sentences can be read on their own and make sense on their own. And that's what a simple sentence does. And when we tend to write very informal documents, we often write in simple sentences. What you do need to be slightly aware of is a lot of people do what's called comma splicing. And that is to join all their simple sentences together with commas. So it would be quite common to see somebody put a comma here after Friday, one after proposal, and just stick that as one giant sentence with a few breaks. And actually that is incorrect English. Now again, it does depend on the recipient, but it is good practice to start getting into the habit of using good sentence structure, no matter who you're sending your document to. We've not mentioned compound sentences here, but compound sentences are those joined by certain joining words like and, but, or, and so. And they can be used in any kind of document type. And then more complex sentences, they tend to make use of commas and other language and join subordinate clauses to the main clause, which is a simple sentence. So a main clause is a simple sentence, and a complex sentence will have an additional idea that won't make sense on its own, but that can be added into another sentence. And there's lots of different ways you can do this. There's loads of different sites and things you can find out about complex sentences, just to give you a little taster here. And one word that's particularly useful in formal documents is which. And it's a nice word to use in complex sentences, like the one here. So the report, which must be submitted by Friday, needs to contain the full proposal and graph of sales. You can see we're saying the same information as we were above, but this time we've put it all in one sentence, and we've made use of punctuation to help the flow of the sentence, to help it be understood. And actually, I think this one is a little clearer because all the ideas are contained together. And it really doesn't matter what type of sentence you're using, but if you're writing a long document, you need to use a variety of sentence styles, otherwise it'll seem a little strange. And you do need to practice making sure you can construct complex sentences yourself, because there's lots of ways to do it and lots of mistakes you can make with commas. So it is a very important skill to have if you're going to do a lot of writing for your business. Active and passive sentences. Now this is something a lot of people have never come across before, and it can take a while to get into the habit of doing it. So active sentences are one where the subject of the sentence, now a subject is always a person or a thing, and that subject is carrying out the action of the sentence. So if we look on the right here, the admin staff are busy completing the reports. So the subject are the admin staff, and the action they're doing is completing. And we can see clearly there that the admin staff are the ones doing the action of completing. And then here, do not use company property for personal use. So that's another active sentence because the action is active. So passive sentences are one where the action is being done to the subject. So not the other way around. It's sort of the reverse. And you will always use the passive voice in those extremely formal documents. Again, those reports and things. That's where you'll come across the passive voice. So instead of saying the admin staff are the ones doing the completing, we switch it around. The reports are being completed by the administration staff. So this time the subject of the sentence has become the reports, but the reports are not doing any actions themselves. They're having an action done to them. So the action of completing is being done to the reports. They're not doing the action. Using company property for personal use is prohibited. So again, we're switching around the idea of where the action is taking place. So it's something again to be aware of. And what you can do if you're not too familiar is look at the style of existing documents and see which ones are written in a more active way and which ones are written in a more passive way. And once you start to do that, and you can start to replicate some of those sentences, that's when you'll find you're getting a bit more comfortable with that style. And again, it's being careful. If you use too many passive sentences when you're doing informal communication, you might come across as being a little bit distant from people. And it may seem as if you're giving them a bit more instruction or telling people what to do rather than being friendly. So it's getting the balance right between the different styles. Proofreading. I mentioned before that proofreading is extremely important. You should always proofread everything. However, a few small errors for very informal documents, so little typos and things, can be forgiven. I would definitely be aware of making mistakes with common words. So things like homophones where you're mixing up there, and there, or your, Y-O-U-R, and your, Y-O-U apostrophe R-E. Because if people see mistakes like that, they tend to assume that you don't know how to use the words rather than you've just typed them incorrectly. So always make sure that you're proofreading to look for any mistakes that will reflect your English skills in a bad light rather than just being a little typing error. And of course, if you're using your phone or tablet and you've got autocorrect on, you do need to read those back because some of the autocorrect options could be quite embarrassing. Fact and opinion. So facts in formal documents should be backed up by evidence. Informal documents sometimes can contain interpretation or opinion. And again, this will depend upon the audience. So are you trying to convince an audience with something, or are you just giving them some information? So if you're posting on your social media for your customers, you may well actually want to back up some of your information with facts to make it seem more reliable. So instead of just saying most people will buy from us again, which is more of an interpretation because the word most could be interpreted in different ways. What does most mean? A fact would be 65% of clients stated that they would buy the same product again. So that's more evidence-based because you've given it a statistic. So again, it's considering which form is more suitable for the audience that you're conveying it to. If you're doing some kind of report at a meeting, you might use both. So you might informally say most people will buy from us again, and then you might go into some statistics and facts to back that up. There's lots of different ways that you can use this information. But again, check which one you're expected to use if there's an expectation that you'll be only using facts and statistics. And our final one is multiple or single verbs. And this is again something you probably won't be aware of perhaps, but once you see it, you'll actually start to see it in other places too. So this is using a single verb to describe an action rather than more than one, because it makes the sentence sound more formal and professional. And once you see the examples, you'll understand what I mean. So we need to find out about the new business park. So our verb there is find out. And that's a little bit more informal. If we look at our next sentence, we've made it more formal. We need to investigate the new business park. So instead of using two words, find out, we're using one, investigate. How many clients have taken up the new offer? So our verb there, taken up. To make it more formal, how many clients have accepted the new offer? So you can see the only words that have changed are these verbs, and instead of two words, we've chosen one word to replace it. And just by making that small change, you increase the level of formality of the document. So those are the main tips on the differences between formal and informal writing. So the main things to remember are to decide what kind of document you're writing, to decide who the audience is that's receiving it, and to make a decision on the level of formality if you need to, or to continue with the same level of formality as the existing document. So I hope that's been useful, and good luck with all of your formal and informal writing in the future.